Good evening and welcome, everybody. My name is Matthew Durst. I'm the artistic director of Ars Lyrica Houston, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here for this moment with the artists before we start our program at 6 p.m. Because we're featuring several instruments in solo roles tonight, I thought we'd spend a few minutes just talking about our instrumentarium and the particular instruments that we have on stage behind us. This program features a couple of instruments prominently in solo roles, notably the harpsichord in the opening concerto of Bach, and also the trumpet in both the Scarlatti and the Bach cantatas. Voice, of course, is also featured prominently, and we have a kind of unusual couple of instruments in the continuo as well, because the Italianate pieces, the Folia piece of Vivaldi and the Scarlatti cantata, really cry out for a plucked stringed instrument player. Michael Leopold is here to play not only theorbo, but also his Baroque guitar on all of the pieces, including the Bach cantata and the concerto on the program, because a little more continuo support is always welcome in music like this. First, a word about the harpsichord, and then I'll introduce my two colleagues behind me, who will have a thing or two to say about their own instruments. Bach wrote these harpsichord concertos, as I explained in the program notes, originally probably as organ concertos. He would have imagined delivering them, I should think, on an instrument kind of like this, that is to say, an early 18th century harpsichord. This one happens to be modeled after an instrument built by Nicolas Dumont of Paris in 1707. I've had the pleasure of seeing the original of this instrument in various bits and pieces in the shop of harpsichord builder John Phillips, who also built this instrument behind me, which normally lives in my living room. It's a great copy of an early 18th century French style instrument, which is not so different from German style instruments that Bach would have known, which is to say that it has two keyboards, each of which plays different sets of strings. In the case of the bottom keyboard, there are two different sets of strings that can be engaged at either the unison or the octave level, which adds a bit of brilliance to the sound, highly useful in a room this big in a virtuosic concerto. And the upper keyboard plays a unison set of strings. You can play them singly, that is to say by themselves, or with the benefit of a coupler. When I am shoving the top keyboard into the instrument, that actually couples both manuals together, and if you're close enough, you'll see the top keys move while I'm playing on the bottom keyboard in sort of ghost fashion. That's because I'm using all the sets of strings at once. This particular instrument, the original would have had, or does have, a rather elaborately painted sound lid painting when you open it up. Mine, because I commissioned it when I was a graduate student, it does not have a lid painting, but it does have a very pretty soundboard painting. So you can find a peacock and various flowers and other animals crawling around beneath the strings. It's decorated, in other words, very much in keeping with the French style. Next up, a couple of continuo instruments. Our regular continuo player, Michael Leopold, is here both with his theorbo and a Baroque guitar, and has a few things to say about them. Michael.
Thank you, Matthew. First instrument I'm going to speak about is the theorbo. This also went by another name in the 17th century. It was also called a chitarrone. And this is essentially a bass lute. It's basically the bass instrument of the lute family. It comes to us from Florence. It originates in Florence in about the 1580s or so, and at a time when there was a lot of experimenting in music and trying to find different ways to find different sounds and different ways of highlighting text. And this instrument sort of comes to prominence. And basically what they did to come up with this instrument was they took the bass instrument of the lute family, which would have had a body similar to this, but would have had a peg box going this way, like a Renaissance lute. And they started to add bass strings on it because they needed a lower bass sound because of the new sort of harmonic structure of the music that was coming to light at that time. And then eventually they started to want more and more bass strings, and as the sound of the bass string was lower, so as you got to pitches that were The way to find a low string like that at that time period was to make it really long. And so the reason why theorbos are so long is essentially because of string technology at that time period was some of the advancements that happened later in the 17th century. So around 1670, they introduced what's called the wound string. So they take a piece of gut and they wrap a piece of metal around it to increase the density, and therefore so you can have a thinner string that sounds lower. But at that time period, they didn't, in the early part of the 1600s, the late 1500s, they just would add more gut to a string. So essentially, to have a really low sounding string, if it was short, it would be really thick and wouldn't vibrate. So they'd make the strings quite long. So some theorbos are very long. It's particularly copies of really old theorbos from the early 1600s. This is more of a copy of a French instrument from the early 18th century. So by that time they had wound strings. They could make the instrument a little bit shorter. A couple of particulars about this instrument. As you notice, it has strings on the fretboard, so meaning that strings that are fretted, so they're stopped strings. I stop them with my left hand. And they're tuned essentially like a lute, so they're tuned in fourths. So you have, and then you have the basses, which are plucked strings, and they're just tuned to a scale. And so depending on the piece of music that we're playing, I'll change the scale that I have, so I have different notes. And you basically pluck a low bass note, and then you play the notes on the fretboard like you would any fretted instrument. So this is the theorbo. The other instrument I have here is a little guitar. So this is basically what the guitar looked like in around 1650. This instrument was most commonly called a guitarra spagnola, so a Spanish guitar. It's tuned like a guitar, except it doesn't have a low bass note, so it doesn't have a low E, and the lowest, the sort of, the way the pitches are is quite interesting. It has, so as would be the lowest string on the regular guitar is actually up an octave. And so you have it's basically, while this instrument is essentially an instrument of all basses, this is an instrument of basically all treble strings, which makes it great for strumming. But it basically works like any fretted instrument. It just has a sort of guitar-like tuning with a few particulars. But this is quite handy for dance music, and you'll see that tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Also with us this evening is our regular trumpet player, Nathaniel Mayfield, Nate, who has a thing or two to say about this Baroque trumpet he's holding.
Thank you, Matthew. So this is what's known now as a natural trumpet or a Baroque trumpet. For years, really centuries, it was simply known as a trumpet. So the concept we have now of a modern trumpet with valves is relatively recent. The best way I can describe this instrument is that it's sort of like a very, very long bugle. In fact, it's 4 times longer than the traditional piccolo trumpet that we would be playing this Baroque literature on. And like on a bugle, I'm sure you all know from listening to taps or reverie or the notes get closer the higher you go in the instrument. And so that's the reason that the instrument is so long. And for years, the trumpeters kept pushing the envelope as to how high they can play until they finally hit what we call the clarino octave. And so a trumpeter that could master and play in that 4th octave on the instrument was known as a clarino trumpet player. And this was also known as a clarino trumpet or a clarino part. And there are several different designs. This is a replica of a piece that's in the Nuremberg Museum. Nuremberg was sort of the hub of where they made all of the instruments or the brass instruments. This is an AHA, the second generation of the AHA family where this instrument comes from. Of course, they also made plumbing supplies in Nuremberg, so it's kind of goes hand in hand. So I can demonstrate how the notes get closer together and sort of explain the different octaves as you go, and you'll start to see how you can kind of sort of make a scale out in the 4th octave. So that last one that I played was the beginning already of the second octave. And so you can hear the third octave, right, which is again. Years, all the concertos really were just. Really, that's all the trumpet did. Everybody's, oh, that's great. And then trumpeters, of course, try to keep pushing the envelopes. And so they finally went into the fourth octave. And I'll show you how that sounds as we go up. So you can see how they started to create a scale, and that's where the tradition came also of performing a trumpet with soprano, because they're in the same octave and you have a really kind of a nice call and answer repartee between the two instruments. So in any case, that's sort of a summation of the trumpet. I hope you enjoyed the concert.
Thank you, Nate. Thank you, Michael. Thank you for being here early for this little instrumental show and tell. And I hope you enjoy the program. We'll be back in about 10 minutes.